Hello. Hello. Oh gosh, that's Zoom. Oh, I didn't want to be in Zoom yet.
Able to carry on. We'll record this and then you'll be able to listen to it later on. Everybody's muted, I can see, or Paz has wonderfully muted everybody, which is great. And there's no videos on except me and Pat at the moment. I will turn mine off in a minute. So just to let everybody know that what we're trying to do is this. The presenter, in this case, it's going to be Pat. Next week, it's going to be Sharon, is going to share their slides and talk at the same time. So hopefully you should be able to see the slides. I might jump in, I might unmute myself and jump in at certain points, usually if I think there might be something that needs elaborating or if I have a question. And on chat, we have Paz is there for anything technical. And so if there's anything technical, just ask Paz that. And Mauricio is also on chat as well. So if you have a brief question, you might want to just just put MQ dash, ask the question, and then maybe Mauricio, you can jump in and ask that question. Or if you've got something that is just simply quite long, it's a bit of a long question, or you want to engage with Patrick a bit more, then just say, I have a question, and Paz will unmute you and we'll let you jump in. What we're doing is we're constraining the number of people with video and audio simply because Zoom keeps collapsing for some people when they're trying to do this, because it's just suddenly become the go-to during this time of the zombie apocalypse. So anyway, without any further ado, apart from letting you all know that next week it'll be Sharon, and then there'll be, I think, a couple of weeks, 3-week gap, but we'll let you all know through the social media. And we've already learned something, which is to keep keep the Zoom link off social media. So we'll do that next time. But as I said, if we have any problems, we have a couple of backup plans. The first one is I will send you all a link to Google Hangouts, and we'll just have a 5-minute pause and go to there. Or if there's if the whole thing just, the internet just dies and everybody starts eating each other, then Pat will just carry on and we will have a recording. So without further ado, I also want to say this, one last thing, is if we can make this work, and we will learn and learn and learn, if we can make this work, then we also hope that this will enable us to decenter the center and to enable more people to present LCT center roundtables from around the world. So if we can get this going, if we can get 2 or 3 under our belt that work really well and seem to be quite popular, then we will be open to suggestions for doing more talks later in the semester. Okay, without any further ado, I'm just going to shut myself up and let Patrick take over. Okay, Pat?
For sure, let's do it. Okay, so this is a bit of a different experience. I've presented at Roundtable before, but not like this. Firstly, I'll introduce myself. My name is Patrick Locke. I am a PhD student of Carl's. I am in the very final stages of my candidate, in that I've got my examiner's reports back, but are still doing the final corrections. And what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is my PhD work. Not all of it, but we're going to focus in on a couple of little areas of it. I think one of the things I'm going to find most difficult about this is that normally in presentations, I tend to read the room a lot to figure out if I'm going too fast or if anybody's having any difficulty comprehending what's going on or any questions. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to do that. So I really do encourage you guys to please do ask your questions to Mauricio and stuff.
Patrick,
yep.
Assume that you're going too fast.
Okay,
always.
Good. I'll keep that in mind. But yeah, so I'm very happy to take questions throughout is really the point I'm trying to make here. So firstly, to start with, so what my presentation is titled Mapping an Educational Field Undergoing Change. And that's fundamentally what I was looking at in my thesis, is trying to look at a field as sort of neoliberal policies were introduced upon it and what impact that had on it. I put these couple of diagrams here at the start. These are some from Bourdieu's work to kind of terrify half of you, because they are very intense. Nothing in this presentation is going to be nearly as intense, or so you don't need to worry. So, so what are we looking at here? What I'm primarily focusing on is just change in education. This is sort of across educational contexts, and it's the idea that increasingly within educational settings, neoliberal policies, principles, and values have become more and more prominent. And you know, I've been at the university as a student, both an undergrad and a PhD student, for almost 10 years now, and I can see these changes happening even over that duration. And how they play out is different in different settings, but there's kind of some a whole bunch of different policy areas they start on. So whether this be sort of like some of the examples I've listed here, quantifying student performance and attempting to quantify staff performance as well. Sort of this quantification culture, it allows things to be comparable. We can weigh up what is our most efficient use of our money. This sort of increase in administration and in a sort of auditing culture, less classroom autonomy for teachers, so more sort of outside oversight. And this is becoming more the case in higher education, but is definitely already the case in other areas. One of the big areas is the casualization of staff. In the university sector, this has been an ongoing issue that casual staff are more economically efficient, but educationally, the difference between, you know, a PhD student like myself teaching you and a professor teaching you might be fairly substantial, but the economic costs kind of justify the casualization and the push to casual staff. Additionally, sort of the push to online learning in the sector, with the idea that, you know, it's good for overcoming educational distance. If we can do distance education, it's good for students with disabilities who can't necessarily access. It improves access to education. But at the same time, it also has a lot of economic benefits in that it's, once you've got a content online, it can be more efficient to access. It opens up your student pool. So sort of a couple of competing pushes there. And final example, sort of like opening up markets in education where potentially they didn't exist before. Now, these are all pretty different areas that I've just touched upon, but you can kind of link them all together with this idea of neoliberalism getting more for less. As budgets are tightened of public sector institutions, they've got to find ways of, you know, stretching their cash further, and this is some of the ways they're trying to do that. And why I was particularly interested in these sort of policies, like these policies are pretty universal, they're touching across a whole range of sectors in society, but why I was interested in these policies interacting with education is that education has its own distinct set of values that it's built up over time, sort of these liberal humanist ideas about education, education for education's sake, for the social benefits it provides students, it's got emancipatory benefits for students, and that it's a good in and of itself. Which obviously, you know, you can't quantify that. It's hard to turn that into dollar terms. And so there's a conflict here between these two ideas. And that's what I wanted to sort of look at, is like how this field deals with this conflict. So, no, it is not moving. Cool. Specifically, I wanted to focus in on educators under neoliberalism. Because these people have often worked in this setting for a long period of time. And a lot of them have sort of built up these values about education, what they believe are the purpose of education. And they really strongly believe in these values. And so when these new competing principles of neoliberalism are brought into the field, they can feel pulled between competing sets of values. That's a pretty common theme in the literature, is that educationalists struggle when presented with these competing values and either try to attain both and end up sort of stressed and burnt out, or reject these new neoliberal values. If you've got good job security, you can definitely afford to do that, or you kind of buy into these ideas. So specifically, I wanted an example of these forces playing out in an Australian context. And that is how I came across looking at vocational education as a field. It has been in the news fairly regularly over the last few years for sort of our international audience. I kind of just wanted to provide a little context, but basically it has had a number of reforms introduced into it over time of a sort of neoliberal leaning. And the reason why it's had so many reforms is that, in a similar way to sort of the British further education sector, it's thought of as sort of a second-class sibling of education. It's a second-tier system almost. Within the literature, it's been described as the Cinderella sector of education, whereas compared to schools and universities, it's uncared for and underfunded. And the end result of this is it's a sector which doesn't have autonomy. It's had lots and lots of changes. It's acted as sort of a laboratory for marketization policies in Australia, because it doesn't have much power or influence. I think one of the easiest ways to think about this is that a lot of the people making decisions about these fields, sort of politicians and such, they don't have a vocational education background, whereas they're more likely to come from a university setting and sort of feel a loyalty there. And why that makes it a useful case study in this instance is that because it's the laboratory where you test out some of these policies, it can act as a bit of a weather vane for other educational systems. So changes that you see, in vocational education now may be coming for higher education in the future. And you can definitely trace, some of these changes have made it to higher education. So it's an very interesting case study. And just to do as a quick comparison between the two, to kind of emphasize how much further down the track vocational education is. The casualization in vocational education is way higher than higher education, where it's thought of as a pretty compelling issue. The oversight of teaching in vocational education is much more prescriptive and intense. You audited regularly. You have to validate that your assessments are achieving very specific parts of a training package. And finally, just in terms of a market, in higher education in Australia, we talk about uncapping course places, uncapping fees, but still limiting them. But still kind of the provider market is really controlled. There's 40 universities in Australia, and it's not going to be a big increase in that. Whereas in vocational education, the market has over 5,000 providers. It's especially for a period of time, which I'm going to be talking about today. It's much more of a free-for-all. So it is just sort of further down the track here, which is why it's a pretty useful little case study. So specifically looking at my research. So there's quite a bit of literature out there looking at vocational education and marketization within the sector. There's quite a bit of research on it. But for all the points I kind of made, that it is an intriguing sector. It's unusual. It's kind of this weather vane idea. But within that research, a lot of it is looking at policy documents and seeing how they play out. Sort of polemic pieces as well, examining the sector from an insider's perspective. And that does make sense because there has been such a regular pace of change, a fast pace of change in the sector. It makes sense that, you're going to just be looking at policy documents because that's when it's changing so quickly. That's that's the best you got. But what I wanted to do in my PhD study was get the perspective of those who are actually involved in implementing these changes, those on the ground who see the impacts on their day-to-day teaching. And that is teachers, really. So I wanted to make sure that I incorporated teachers within my study to see how they adapted to these changes, because they were the one being put in this bind between neoliberal ideas and traditional educational ideas. So, and specifically, I wanted to look at, so as I mentioned before, there's many, many providers in the sector, but I wanted to look at TAFE teachers. Now, TAFE, for our international audience, is the big public provider of vocational education. Traditionally, it's been the primary provider, it's provided the vast bulk of it, but over time, it is provided for less and less of the market as the private providers have opened up to sort of compete with TAFE. And the reason why TAFE teachers in particular were the group I wanted to look at was because they fit this criteria really nicely. They're the oldest educational workforce in Australia. The average TAFE teacher is 51 years old, compared to school teachers and compared to university educators as well. And many of them are highly experienced in the sector. Many of them have been working in it for a long period of time. And so my idea was that these would be the people who are most imbued with these values about public education and would find these new changes so confronting. The final thing is an important point to emphasize here is that the vet field is very diverse. There's all sorts of different teaching going on. You have, bicycle repair workshops. You have accounting teaching. You have design. There's costume and set design. There's horticulture. There's security and IT technology. It covers a really broad range of training, and you're training from sort of one-day courses to now within vocational education they even do degrees. So the range of qualifications is really big, and the range of areas that they're teaching are really, really big. And so one of the things that I thought was important was that I did have a good perspective on different areas of this field rather than just focusing on one area. Because it's so diverse, the idea is that different sectors might respond differently to these sort of changes and because they are teaching at such different levels. So specifically about my study, what it involved was a mixed methods project. I did a survey of a broad range of TAFE teachers before diving into in-depth interviews and I picked 3 specific areas of teachers to do interviews upon. This was trades teachers, hospitality teachers, and nursing teachers. I picked these 3 areas because they represent sort of different value systems at play within the sector. So the trades is highly traditional. They've been a big part of vocational education for many, many, many years. But doesn't really have that educational background. Most of the people who were trades teachers were tradies themselves. So they were, electricians, carpenters. They'd worked on the tools and then moved into TAFE as educators to teach people how to be electricians, carpenters, mechanics, etc. Hospitality was chosen as it's a relatively new field. It was only they started doing training in the late 80s and 90s, as opposed to, the early 1900s. And it doesn't have a strong educational tradition because it's so new. It's again, people mostly come from working in the sector. In the hospitality, hotel management and cookery are the 2 big areas. So you've either worked as a hotel manager or as a chef, moved into TAFE to start teaching it. So it's a much newer one, and it's doesn't have sort of the historical legacy that the trades do, and it doesn't also have that sort of guild-based culture. The final area of teachers I picked, who I'm not going to talk about today, so I'll only briefly describe it, is nursing educators, and they're different altogether because they all have a tertiary education background. So all have a degree. Many of them teach between university and TAFE. And there's sort of a different disposition there. It's not a commercial industry, which adds another little twist to it. So of this sample of teachers, I interviewed 26 teachers in total between these 3 areas. Today, we're only going to talk about the trades and hospitality ones. These teachers were mostly teachers with a few head teachers as well. And there was a mixture of full-time, part-time, and casual teachers amongst the sample. Importantly, this is an important thing to emphasize, especially when I pointed out before that, casualization in this sector is big. Casuals are underrepresented as part of my sample. So I only had 4 casual teachers amongst the 26. The reason for that basically was access. It's really difficult to access casual teachers they're not being paid for their additional time around classes. So they're probably, this is my guess, is they're unwilling to be part of an interview when you're not being paid for it or you're not being supported in that way, which is entirely reasonable. As someone who's worked as a casual academic, I very much sympathize with them. So yeah, that is one of the issues with my study, was that I have a few casual teachers' perspectives, but it would have been good if there was more. And they did bring some really interesting points to the study as well. So the specific reforms I'm examining. So there's one particular reform, which was called the Smart and Skilled Reform. I'm going to jump over some of these details because I don't think they're that important. But basically, it was rolled out in other states first before finally being rolled out in New South Wales in 2015. What it effectively did was open up the market even further to private providers competing with TAFE for government funding through creating what was kind of a voucher-based system where an individual could pick which training provider they would go to for their course, and they'd take their voucher with them, and that would get them some government funding. Importantly, it did succeed at opening up the market. There was many, many new training providers opened up to compete in this market. There was a bunch of problems, mostly around less reputable providers incentivizing students to do their courses. There was problems with the loan scheme, and so some of the changes that were involved in this reform were kind of stepped back over the years. But the important thing for me here is that basically it was opening up the market and making TAFE, or attempting to make TAFE, compete within that market. The process of how this impacted upon my teachers was that TAFE was started needing to compete and be more efficient, and they started borrowing practices from the private sector, to try to make them more efficient. And then the teachers had to either implement those practices or affected by those practices. And so that's how this kind of played out for the teachers in my study. So my interviews were done during 2016 and 2017. So they'd already been under these new reforms for 2 to 3 years. So they'd had time to adapt to them. And you can see that in some of their language. They talk about the reforms that happened in the past. So, but they're still kind of in the adaptation process. They had, many of them, as you will see soon, had not accepted these changes particularly. So moving on to the LCT components. So what did I use LCT for? Well, I use autonomy codes as my way of thinking about the field as a whole and thinking about how external forces impacted the field. So to give you a sort of brief overview of autonomy codes, there's 2 concepts we're going to be using here: positional autonomy and relational autonomy. So positional autonomy, I've got the definitions here, is a relationship between constituents positioned within a context or category and those positions in other contexts or categories. Whereas relational autonomy is the relations between relations among constituents of a context or category and relations among constituents of other contexts or categories. And here you have the plane with the codes. So in terms of my study, I think one of the most important things when using autonomy is finding ways to apply these theoretical concepts to your study and locking them in on your study. What you're really looking for is what your field is going to be. So let's just jump to the second. Transferring these concepts or defining these concepts within my study, positional autonomy is the idea is whether they are positioned inside or outside education. And relational autonomy I took as whether they're pursuing goals that are educational goals or non-educational goals. So breaking this down even further, I'm going to show you some translation devices I use to translate from like these high-level theoretical concepts to my data. And I think that's like probably the best way into explaining like how exactly they play out in my research. So we'll start with the positional autonomy at the top, and then we'll move to relational autonomy. This is, many of you will be familiar with translation devices from other areas of LCT. These are adopted from Carl and Sarah's occasional paper on autonomy, but, obviously applied to my specific area of research. So the first divide is positioning these agents. So in terms of this study, this is where the teachers position themselves. Do they position themselves inside or outside of the educational field? So the target zone is within education. The non-target zone is outside education. Now, there's a second degradation or a second level of detail that you can get here, which is even when they're for those inside education, there's those positioned within the core and those in the ancillary. So in terms of the field I'm looking at, which, the educational field, the core was what they saw as purely teaching roles. So anything that was solely related to educating students, they saw as the core. Whereas the ancillary, they saw them as sort of tasks or activities they did, which were supporting those educational roles, but not necessarily the educating themselves. So my examples here were administration, compliance, and classroom discipline. Now, I've had sort of discussions or arguments with people in the past about this, particularly about classroom discipline. But the important thing here is that, these can move between categories. None of it is like strictly in boxes. So it's not so much important like exactly where these reside, and there's different strengths and degradations throughout. So it's relational. So it's not so much important exactly how they fit in. Now, in terms of positional autonomy, moving to the things that are outside the field of education, what we call the non-target, we have two degradations again, which is associated and unassociated. So associated is things that they saw as how the teachers were framed was like organizational, but not necessarily educational roles. So when they're asked to connect more with industry partners, they saw that as something that's good for TAFE as an organization, good for, but isn't necessarily an educational activity for the students or directed towards the students. Same with sort of financing or doing course viability costings, like when they have to cost whether their course is financially viable. And the final one was unassociated. So that's non-educational roles, which is literally anything else. One of the important things with autonomy codes is that while you have a really strict definition for your target is defined on an object. By the time you get to your unassociated, it's literally anything else. So it's not as tightly defined. And what I've done in my research and in this presentation is divide up the autonomy plane a little more with these sort of little dotted lines, which you can see here. I don't know if my mouse is actually showing on the thing, but I'm hoping it is. And they divide this into the core, ancillary, associated, and unassociated for positional autonomy. I hope that makes sense. I've kind of lined them up. Moving to relational autonomy. So this is not necessarily about where the teachers are positioned. This is about what their goals are, what they're oriented towards, what they're trying to pursue. So we have the same divide here between target and non-target. So the target is educational goals. The non-target is any other goals, non-educational goals. Within educational goals, we have the core, ancillary divide again, and the core was purely educational goals. So this is things they saw as the core of their classroom teaching, what they wanted the students to get out of it. So this is idea about like holistically supporting students. It doesn't like this can happen outside the classroom, but they really felt like supporting students through education was one of their central purposes. And then sort of developing knowledge and skills that were essential, which were, the goal for them. The ancillary goals, so those slightly less core to the field, were any sort of things that were like goals that were supporting this process, but not necessarily like the fundamentals of this is my in-class teaching. So one that they talk about regularly for this was employment outcomes. So they wanted to give their students these knowledge and skills, and that was their central focus. That's what they really liked doing. They felt that it was also one of their goals that the students get employed, but that wasn't necessarily the central goal. They might be providing them skills which might not lead to their employment right now, but will give them life skills into the future, which will improve their employment opportunities into the future, if that makes sense. So moving into the sort of non-target, non-educational goals, we have same degradation, associated, unassociated, and in the same sort of divide here, actually, where the goals are organizational, but not educational. So one of these is, so these are goals that might be important to TAFE as an organization, but the teachers didn't think were educational in and of themselves. So one here, which is a highly contentious one, is completion percentages. And what that means is the percentage of students who start a course, what percentage of those complete the course. And this has become, as I know some people who work in the sector would know, very highly valued within vocational education. This is a really important stat. You need to keep a good completion percentage. And the teachers understood that it was a good sign, but did not see this as connected to a pure, so they didn't see it as an educational goal because they saw all this other stuff that would affect completion percentage that was out of their control. So things in students' if a student can drop out for so many reasons and not complete, and they don't have control over that. So as a teacher, it feels beyond their capacity. And so they don't see it as a central goal of their work. But they do see that it is connected, which is an important point. It's not entirely unassociated. An entirely not associated goal would be sort of profitability. So this is any other, it can be anything else, right? But within this case study, within my work, often the unassociated goals would be when they talk about the profit motive. They would see this as entirely disconnected from their work, and it didn't hold value for them. They didn't care how much profit a student was generating, and they didn't feel as if that should be an important factor within their decision making or a goal for them. They shouldn't be pursuing profitability. Sorry.
How are you doing, Patrick?
Good. I just got distracted by my dog. Okay. Oh yeah. So so what you can do is, as I talked about before, for positional autonomy, this divides the plane into sort of 4 zones. And if I press this button and this thing flips over, these are the zones. So here we've got our relational autonomy axes, and we have core, ancillary, associated, unassociated. So it divides up into sort of 16 little mini sections. So what I want to do is quickly run through how we're doing time-wise. Yeah, we're okay. We're going to quickly run through an example of how I used this translation device in my work. And then I'm going to go into actually presenting some of the data. So basically what I'm looking at here is going to be teacher quotes, and it's how the teachers talk about stuff, whether they talk about, whether they're talking about things and valorizing stronger positions or weaker positions, depending on positional or relational autonomy. So to start with, we're going to look at one for positional autonomy, and I've got a few examples here that kind of capture some of the central points. So a good example of like a statement which reflects core positional autonomy would be, we find our happy time in the class talking about industry and delivering content. So in this instance, the teacher's really valorizing that, like, in classroom educating, and that role of being an in classroom educating teacher is the core of their work. That's their happy time. To provide a strong comparison, we'll jump down to the bottom, where this is how them sort of talking about what they would say is a real weak, unassociated positional autonomy role, which would be, whereas you had people like me who weren't entrepreneurs, who weren't marketing people, who'd been teaching there, and we were suddenly expected to sell. So how this teacher's describing it is that they were being expected to perform roles that they saw as entirely uneducational. As you can see what they do, they characterize themselves as a teacher. They've been teaching there. They weren't marketing people. They weren't entrepreneurs, and suddenly they were being expected to sell. So that would be a good example of sort of weakest positional autonomy, which is unassociated. I'll just work through a little example. So, it has changed. They not only see us as deliverers of training, but they expect us to be business people as well. So using my little code of colors here, they not only see us as deliverers of training. So deliverers of training, I kind of coded as ancillary because it's not a purely educational framing of their role. And that's how teachers would describe it as well. It's something, the training, deliverers of training is a bit murky, especially this idea that it's not educating, it's training. It's a bit contested. But it's still within the field of education, within the field of vocational education. But then when they talk about, but they expect us to be business people as well, that's a kind of example of weakest positional autonomy because it's entirely unconnected to an educational role, this idea of being business people. And we'll jump through to an example from relational autonomy. So I'll just do the same process there. So an example of core relational autonomy would be this top quote. You want to make people a better tradesman than you think you are. That should be the goal of a teacher. If I think I've sent that person out with more skills and knowledge than I had, I'm happy. So in this instance, it's entirely focused on the the student themselves and them developing their skills. It's not talking even about them getting employed. It's not talking about how much it costs to train them. It's talking on a purely educational scale that I want them to be as skilled as they possibly can be. It's more skills and more knowledge. Now, in terms of, let's jump down to an unassociated. So this would be entirely non-educational goals. Because the reforms are all dollar driven, the bottom line is the easiest way to do that is to increase class numbers, cut delivery hours. So from the teacher's perspective, this is coming from an entirely non-educational perspective. This is coming from an economic perspective. You know, they're entirely dollar driven. The bottom line is the most important thing. They're considering economic factors, not educational factors. So we'll just work through one last example and then we'll get into the real deal of applying this translation device. So we are a public education provider. Our ethos should be about providing fair and equitable education to all members of society. Rather, we are turning into a business focused on the bottom dollar rather than the social good of education. So this one is a fairly compelling one and a fairly obvious one, but our ethos should be about providing fair and equitable education for all members of society. So that is, embodies a lot of the traditional goals of education, sort of liberal humanist ideas, education for education's sake, but also that it's emancipatory. And they're also the public education. They have a responsibility to members of the public to provide them with this. It's an ethos. So that would be, the core strength positional autonomy. Whereas rather than turning into a business focused on the bottom dollar is obviously being set up in opposition to that. And that is the private sector kind of, or a business. And that is what they see as non-educational. So finally, moving on to how I'm going to structure this. So what we're going to be looking at is we're looking at these two teachers within my study. We're looking at the trades teachers and the hospitality teachers. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to locate them within the autonomy plane. So as we talked about before, we have the autonomy plane. We're going to look at some quotes from each of these groups and position them within the field. The second thing we're going to do is once we've positioned them and we can see the relative sort of difference between these two groups, we're going to look at how they understood the effects of reform, how they described them, how they conceived of the reforms as a whole, and see if that was different as well. And finally, we're going to look at how they sort of responded to these reforms, how they evaluated them. And that's kind of the structure we'll go through. So we're going to do, for each of them, we'll start with the trades, then we'll move to hospitality. So in terms of locating our trades teachers in the field, we're going to go positional autonomy, then relational autonomy, and then we'll code them, and then we'll do the same thing for the hospitality teachers. So starting with this first quote, these guys are 35, 40 years, just been doing the same thing. They've seen the technology, they adapt, their experience, their knowledge, it's gold. So this is from, this is actually one of my casual teachers I'm in, and he is talking about the teachers he started working with when he'd been there for a couple of years as a casual, who had been working for TAFE for 35 or 40 years. So in terms of coding this, the last bit kind of gets at it really, which is their knowledge, it's the gold, it's entirely focused on the educational origins of these teachers. The fact that they've been in this setting for 35 or 40 years is framed as a strength by him. And he sort of will, Lindsay kind of reflects a similar thing, but he later in the interview talked about how he really regretted not getting more information from them, not getting more of their knowledge from them before they retired. So what you can see from this is that, the trades teachers valorizing being a long-term occupant of the field and being deeply located within the field, that knowledge, this long-term, their experience is the important thing, which would be core positional autonomy because it's the core of the field. The second example here is from Lindsay. He's talking about who's an older but full-time teacher. I would have been more of a pest than I really was to try and extract stuff out of them, because as people leave industry, they take a lot of this knowledge. It's the gold. The knowledge is the thing. Weird they both describe the knowledge as the gold. That is a coinkydink. But I think it kind of gets to the central thing that they feel as if, these trades teachers, they characterize themselves as highly experienced, and they think their experience is incredibly valuable within the sector. And they see that, their educational experiences makes them, the central it's one of their central strengths within the field is this position. So once again, it's sort of this describing of educational knowledge as core, their role as a core role. And we actually have a couple of other teachers here who were all, these are all trades teachers, but agreed with this characterization that many trades teachers had been long-term occupants of the field, but were a bit more skeptical about whether that was a good thing or not. So you're dealing with teachers, they're good teachers, but they've been public servants for over 20 years. And Gary was talking about this in the context of these teachers not being able to adapt as well to current changes. And I mean, really, in terms of my research outlook of wanting to look at teachers who were long-term experienced teachers in the field, this is exactly what the sort of people I wanted to look at who were imbued with these values. And Gary, he himself admitted he'd been in the field for a very long time, but it's hard for them to adapt because they have been public servants for so long. But it's that same thing of emphasizing duration in the field as like one of their central characteristics. So they're long-term occupants of the field. And they, he kind of talked later about how it meant they were kind of disconnected from other fields as well. Like a lot of them had been working at TAFE so long, they weren't necessarily working in industry anymore. This was kind of their sole identity. It was solely educators. And Mark, another one of the teachers, talked about them being rusted on public servants, which once again kind of emphasizes this core position within the field of being a long-term educator. So on the whole, the trades teachers could be characterized as embodying core positional autonomy due to their long history within the field and seeing that as like one of their central characteristics or one of their central strengths in many cases. So moving now to relational autonomy, which is, what goals they were oriented towards, how they felt the field of vocational education should work. My trades teachers, they don't mince words, which is one of the things I like about them. So we'll go through a few of their quotes about what the goals of the field should be. This first one from John, who is another casual teacher, but a much older casual teacher. TAFE, it's the best learning process available for tradesmen. Anyone who says different, they're full of shit. As I said, it's a nice way with language, but so in this, he really clearly talks about, he valorizes TAFE as an organization. He's talking about how it's got the best learning process available for tradesmen. And that is his central judge of what makes a good provider in this setting. So, the idea that you should be entirely judged by what gives the best learning outcomes for the student, how the student learns the best. And he says that TAFE does it the best, and that should be the thing that matters. And we'll get to a quote later, which kind of re-emphasizes this. And once again, it's sort of core relational autonomy, that it's only based on educational principles. It shouldn't be based on any other things, only educational goals. He doesn't say it's the most efficient learning process available. He says it's the best. And that's it. So moving on to the second one from Hicks. Whereas, this is talking about change over time within TAFE. Whereas originally TAFE was, the teachers ran it and mostly with the majority say on things, and it was educational. So yeah, the model has changed. And the philosophy seems to be that private things work better. So he is now setting up sort of a dichotomy of a change over time within TAFE, that in the past it was run by the teachers and it was educational. So this idea that the teachers ran it and it was educational is sort of core, is run along educational goals. And that's contrasted with the current perspective that private things work better, which isn't an educational principle. I mean, from his perspective, it's not, whether it's private or public is not so much the important thing, is whether it's like educational or non-educational. And he saw the way previously it was run by the teachers and it was educational, whereas now it's run along the lines of this other principle borrowed from elsewhere, like borrowed from economics, really, that private things work better. And that is distant to him. It's alien. It doesn't resolve with how he feels the sector should be. And that would be a good example of a sort of unassociated goal, disconnected with the field. Finally, another quote from John. You want to make people a better tradesperson than you think you are. That should be the goal of a teacher. I think I've sent that person out now with more skills than I had and a pathway to go and learn more. So this is, obviously borrowing an example from before, but it's entirely educationally focused. That should be the goal of a teacher, make them a better tradesperson with more skills than I had. And interestingly, and a pathway to go and learn more. So he's not focusing on employment again. He's focusing in another aspect of this is that, lifelong learning, that you're setting them up with educational skills and knowledge that will allow them to get even more education in the future. And then that's part of the goal as well. It's not just about getting a job at the end of it. So I reckon pathway and go and learn more should also be sort of a core educational goal. So this kind of comes up to core relational autonomy because they're valorizing the core principles of the field, core ways of working of the educational field, and that's the way it should be. They're saying that we should focus only on educational outcomes and educational goals, and that doing anything else is, it's not the way we want to work. So bringing these two together, we had our trades teachers who positioned themselves as long-term occupants of the field, and who positioned themselves, who wanted to work in traditionally educational ways towards traditionally educational goals. That kind of positions them right up in the top right corner of the sovereign code because they are a core in both. So moving on to my hospitality teachers. And starting with positional autonomy. So hospitality teachers, you'll see some pretty clear contrasts here between both the ways they talk, but also the things they talk about. So we'll work through that. Now, a lot of the hospitality teachers, the biggest demographic difference is that they had generally not worked for TAFE as long. A lot of them still worked in industry quite actively. And they had a history of like moving between industry and TAFE. So they'd go work in industry for a few years and then they'd come back and work at TAFE for a while. And they'd done this process a bit. This was quite a common feature amongst them. So this is providing some context. So this is working in hotels, working in restaurants, that sort of thing is what they tend to go back to. So we connect with industry very well because they do that well because we're typically salespeople, and we do it well because we're typically salespeople as well. Convoluted sentence, but it's that's a direct quote. But what Tony's kind of emphasizing here is that they come from an industry which is full of salespeople, hotel management, the sort of hotelier industry, and then they move into education, but they're still good at that salesman aspect. They're still good at making connections and developing relationships. And that's what they see as, as a central part of their role is like developing relationships with hotels, with businesses, with industry, which is a bit of a different way of framing one of your major activities or what you think is an important part of your role than the trades teachers. So to code this in terms of autonomy codes, connect with industry very well is probably an ancillary goal because, even some of the teachers admitted that they wanted to connect with industry, that they felt that was an important part. Some of them probably thought that wasn't a part of their role. So it probably sits somewhere between ancillary and associated. But in this example, I sort of decided to code it as ancillary. So within the field of education. But then characterizing yourself as, we're typically salespeople as well. That's like a role that's not educational. I don't think it's like entirely disconnected from education. So that's why in this example, I coded it as associated. Because there is some expectation that you're able to do that to students and stuff, but so it's kind of putting them at the border. So these two they're not as strongly in the core, let's say, as my trades teachers.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, I just thought it might be nice for you to have a break for a second from just talking. Yeah, take a swig of your tea. Did you have any issues in coding your quotes from people? I mean, did you find that? 'Cause, a lot of people here, they'd be interested in how these different groups are going to be hit by marketization and so on, which I know you're going to get moving towards. Don't spend forever on just setting them up in the field, remember?
Yeah, we're getting there.
Get to the marketization before too long. But I was just wondering, in terms of methodologically, did you struggle at all with putting things in places to just fit together, or was this just something that you had to do a kind of back and forth. I mean, people often think the translation devices are easy to make, but in my opinion, they are, the result of the analysis, not rather than something you just use to analyze.
Yeah, definitely. No, definitely not easy to do. And honestly, I'm still unsure about some of the coding sometimes. As I talked about with this one, it's kind of on the border pretty regularly. Developing the translation device was a little tricky. I actually borrowed a strategy that Elena Lambrinos used, which was getting a bunch of her quotes, and it's really easy to tell which ones are sort of the core and which ones are the unassociated, which ones are either end of the spectrum, but making the divisions within the ones in the middle is a lot harder. And physically, like having a bunch of quotes in front of me and finding ways to chop them up that felt like clearer divides. And that's kind of how I developed it over time. And once I found sort of this organizational divide, because teachers would talk about that, like organizational goals and stuff, that was a kind of crucial part. But like, yeah, it was quite difficult. And it was an iterative process, really. Like it was, I reworked them a number of times until I found something that I found I could develop this translation device, apply it to a quote, and it would divide it up or sort of code it, and I could work backwards as well. So yeah, bit of a process, but I think I've got it to a point where it mostly works pretty well now. Which after 4 years, I certainly hope so. So moving on to the second quote here, which was this is Marie talking about. So the hospitality teachers were also aware that they were quite different to other teachers within TAFE, and so they'd often compare themselves to other teachers, like without my prompting, which I found like really interesting. But here she does it here. So a lot of teachers from other areas or head teachers and managers in other areas don't come from a management background. They come from a vocational background. Because we actually have all worked as hotel managers or department managers or restaurant managers, we've all got that managerial skills. Whereas a lot of other people that you work with, they've worked their way up from TAFE. So here she's describing hospitality teachers as having origins specifically that aren't within TAFE. And that, in terms of her bigger point, that's a strength. That gives them managerial skills, that gives them skills working in industry, which these other TAFE teachers don't necessarily have because they've been long-term occupants of the field. And from my perspective, what this is suggesting is that they kind of reside at the boundaries of the field. They're not just solely within the educational sector and disconnected from other fields. They're residing in the boundaries. They're connecting with other areas, and they have backgrounds in these areas, so they're closely connected to them. So as a kind of, here, this is associated because it's not entirely disconnected. They're teaching, they're working in the areas they're teaching in. So, it's obviously very, very useful. But emphasizing their background in these settings rather than emphasizing their history within the field of vocational education is a really important and distinct difference. The final quote, which is an important one.
But
yes, Mauricio.
Steve Kirk asks, is this interjected expertise?
That's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, I think it would be. So it's tricky, right? And I've had this discussion with a number of people in regards to vocational education, because you do kind of have, it's hard to set up a clear field where you have like one orienting purpose, and because vocational education is meant to be educational, but it's also meant to be vocational. There's meant to be vocational elements within it. So they do have this kind of like dual identity anyway of being like both a teacher and they've got to be a worker in their field. It's like part of their contract that they've got to work a certain amount of hours within their actual practical field. So whether you define that as interjected or whether you define that as like both these elements have to be part of their core person, so its core is like, so it's sovereign is a bit of a tricky one. I hope that kind of provides a little bit of insight, which is, yeah, why when I'm applying this sort of stuff to higher ed, it doesn't necessarily always apply neatly because they don't have that dual identity as much. Cool. I will just go through. So this last one, she's talking about her time working at a private provider and contrasting that with working in TAFE. So this is a cookery teacher talking about a private provider, then TAFE. So some staff came in and just went through the motions, didn't care too much. It was just a disgrace. At TAFE, there was much more of a sense that these were career educators opposed to people who were opportunistic about making money. So really clear contrast here where she sets up that these private providers, these people just care about money. They're not educators, whereas the people at TAFE are career educators. So in a little bit of contrast to this, where they're kind of constructing themselves at the edge of the field, Sheridan's saying that, like, no, we are career educators. Like, we're connected to the other sections or whatever, but compared to the people working in these private providers, we are career educators. That is a calling. That is our vocation. So she's kind of really emphasizing that's like a core identity, is like career educator, is not how some of the other teachers might frame themselves. But so altogether, kind of my idea was that when you thought about these as a whole, these teachers were mostly located at the boundary of the field, but still within it. Like they didn't see themselves as like outsiders entering education. They just saw themselves as connecting with other fields, and that this might, for the most part, maybe Sheridan accepted, this might not be their entirety of their identity. So that for me would be like ancillary positional autonomy, residing at the borders. And finally, we'll just do their relational autonomy. So this first quote from Marie: I guess our industry too, being hospitality, we're such a people person industry and a customer service oriented business that whether it's working for TAFE or working for industry, they're the skills that I've brought in from industry. What she's saying is that, you know, she's got these skills and these goals that she's brought from hospitality, and she's happy to apply them, whether it's TAFE, whether it's industry, whether it's whatever. It's not these distinctly educational goals. It's not this framed the same way as the teachers, where like the educational skills and abilities I bring are the most important, the trades teachers, that is. And, you know, characterizing it, this kind of position where it's like, I bring these customer service skills, I can apply them to either sector, kind of suggests that you're not pursuing necessarily like strictly educational goals. She's bringing other skills to it. I'll do this. I might actually just do one of these quotes because I think I'm going to have to speed up a bit. Yeah, we're running out of time a little. So we'll just jump to the bottom one here. So she's talking about what her goals are. So what my aim really is to do is to get them job ready. They're teed up with the right people. They've got the right networks. They've got the right connections. They've been working in a team. They're working in an area that at least they know they love, and they are far more employable. This is a really different way of describing the goals of your job than the trades teachers. At no point here does she really particularly mention education or skills. She's almost entirely focused on the people themselves, developing their networks, and making them more employable. So these are less educational goals on the whole than these are less educational goals than the trades teachers we're talking about. But, you know, the employability, as we mentioned before, is like an ancillary goal. And the, you know, getting them job ready, get the right networks, that's kind of connected in with the employability. So these are ancillary goals. They're not entirely unassociated or even, you know, outside the field, but they're distinctly different to the core goals that the trades teachers are talking about. Resulting in sort of my final coding of the hospitality teachers as embodying ancillary relational autonomy. The major focus was on these sort of ancillary goals rather than the core goals. So finally, we have our trades teachers, which we coded in the top right corner of the sovereign code. By comparison, our hospitality teachers are probably closer to the center. They're both in the ancillary for both, but from my perspective, really near the boundaries. You know, they see themselves as educators, but they also see themselves just definitely as hospitality workers and moving between those.
Patrick?
Yeah.
Can I just ask, has this slide got a wrong title?
Oh, yes, it does have a wrong title.
Okay, just checking. So this is just coding the three groups in...
That is just coding the two groups. That is just coding the two groups.
Two groups, okay,
yeah. Cool. And I have my trades, sorry about that. I don't know how that got there, but anyway, I have my trades teachers in the top right and my hospitality teachers in the bottom, nearer to the center.
Mm-hmm.
So now what I'm going to look at how these two groups understood the reforms, the marketization reform.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah, sure.
Just a question from Mauricio.
Yeah.
How did you construct, because you have many samples, so to say, or people, how do you construct, for example, that one, nursing or trades or whatever, as a single point in the map? How did you kind of add up? What was your summation for all your codings that you did?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good question. So the reason why I kind of used, it's a hard thing to represent on a diagram. But the reason why I use like circles, like bigger, broader circles rather than like single points is because obviously like these teachers didn't all embody exactly the same position. They embodied different positions at different times in the interviews. But what I wanted to kind of give an idea of is like, this is kind of like the locus of all the teachers in those groups' perspectives. So it's kind of like the median point, the average, and they move around. Like the teachers would move over into the projected and move down into the introjected, and sometimes talk about things like the entirely and the exotic. They're talking about the hospitality teachers here. They'd move around. But yeah, so it's definitely not, this is where this group resides and they always reside there. It's like, this is the locus of them. This is the central point in which they all move around. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right. So I'm gonna be speeding through a little bit, but I think we'll still be okay. So now they're talking about the effects of reforms, how they understood reforms, what they felt reforms did to their actual work. So the trades teachers, when they talked about the impact of reforms on their work. So this first quote is from my fave, John. Incidental hours should be for class prep and for the students, not for admin. I'm not a freaking admin, man. I'm a freaking teacher. So I've got to do all this freaking admin stuff and expected to do it. Wasn't part of it before. So here, John is really clearly showing a divide between tasks that he thinks are acceptable for him to do as an educator, as a teacher, and those which aren't. Now, if you'll remember, admin before was like, we coded that as ancillary. Many teachers like they understood the need for admin in their work. But what he's saying is that the problem for him isn't necessarily like the admin, but it's like that he wasn't asked to do it before. It's not part of his like core educating. Like as he talks about here, incidental hours should be for class prep and for the students. Those are core educational tasks. It's about moving from those tasks to an auxiliary task. Tasks that he sees less part of that educational role. And we'll just jump to the final one. This is Kevin talking about the increase in compliance. Basically, you're ticking boxes to prove that you're doing your job properly, justifying your existence. So the trade teachers in general, but Kevin gives a good example of here, were really skeptical of these ideas of like demonstrating that your teaching was compliant with like standard teaching practice, or they met the training package needs, and they felt that job was arduous, boring, but also just fundamentally not educational, and that it was entirely disconnected from education is how they classified it. So they saw themselves moving from this role where they were teachers to a role where they're admin people, which is slightly weaker, or doing compliance related activities, which they saw as much weaker. But generally, they saw a weakening of positional autonomy due to the reforms. They felt the management now, instead of seeing them as educators, saw them as some non-educational role, that they were these admin people, that they were, doing compliance. And the most important thing was that their teaching was validated and auditable rather than that it was actually good educationally. So they saw this pressure to move down at sort of an unassociated positional autonomy position in the plane. Looking in terms of relational autonomy, so what they saw is the goals of their work, how they felt the reforms impacted the goals of their teaching. So, quote from him in here, the accountants are in control. They're not listening so much to the teachers on the ground. If TAFE's concern is about getting people through it and stuff and making the most money, you don't value all that educational knowledge. So here he's pretty clearly making a point that the goals within TAFE have shifted. Instead of being oriented towards what teachers think, that educational knowledge, it's oriented towards what accountants think, and that's that business knowledge. And the principles of business. We've got to make sure our courses are efficient rather than educationally valid. Which those business principles, as we coded before, were emblematic of unassociated relational autonomy. These goals are entirely disconnected from educational goals. Let's just do one of these. We'll do the first one. So this is John talking about the cutting back of teaching hours and course hours. So this was one of the big areas for TAFE teachers, was that a lot of course, the actual amount of hours that the students did throughout the year were cut down to make them more efficient, make them more cost effective. So we can now cut off our day. So we go from an 8-hour day to a 7-hour day. Okay, yes, we saved all this money. That's fantastic. Who does it hurt? The students. So John here, what's he doing? Well, he's setting up a divide between saving money and doing what's good for the students. And he wants to do what's good for the students, what's educationally beneficial for them. but TAFE now wants to save money. And in the past, TAFE wanted to do what was better for the students, is kind of what's all kind of implied within this quote. And so that's a shift from sort of core relational autonomy goals to unassociated ones. It's all about saving money. It's not about what's good for the student. And he sets those goals up as mutually incompatible. You know, that taking away, attempting to save money actively harms the student. And those are, it's a seesaw. Cool. And so altogether, this kind of can be coded as unassociated racial autonomy. They see the goals of the field shifting towards the goals of business. So as we kind of coded there, they increasingly saw themselves as being pushed into non-educational roles. They saw their role within TAFE as in becoming increasingly non-educational, as they did all these non-educational activities like compliance and admin. And at the same time, they saw the goals of their work as shifting as well. They described weakening relational autonomy in terms of now they're being oriented more towards economic principles. It's about what's economically feasible rather than what's educationally beneficial to the student. So together, those two combine kind of in a pull down from the sovereign all the way down into the exotic, which is obviously a pretty long pull. And that's why the teachers like really talk about it in quite visceral terms. And we'll get a bit to that later. Those are my final little examples.
So Patrick, I don't want to take you off because there's a lot to get through. But so what you're saying here is that this is how the trades educators saw the reforms. They saw the reforms as dragging them from their core target to something very, very far away, not only in terms of what the reforms would bring into vocational education, but also in terms of what the purpose of it was.
Yeah, very much so. And they would regularly refer to like both of those shifts as like separate but connected things. They talk about how they're in classroom teaching and what they actually did had changed, but they also talk about like how the bigger picture goals of TAFE had changed. They felt kind of betrayed by that. Because they had these public education values, this ethos about like what TAFE should provide. And it's like a moral responsibility more almost in that, you know, TAFE was not doing that anymore. And they felt, and that made it real, like, we'll get to this in a bit, but that made it really hard for them to work for TAFE. They really did not enjoy this experience anymore because it wasn't oriented towards these values and these goals, which they thought it had traditionally been. All right, we've got to do these final little bits of comparison. We're talking now about our hospitality teachers and how they describe the changes. Well, obviously, we'll do a couple of these quotes here. This is talking about how their role shifted over time. So Sheridan, this first one about how their role as a hospitality teacher changed. You're like a salesperson. You just sit and have a coffee with them and have a chat with them and tell them about your programs. You're borderline recruiters. It isn't really teaching. It's a pretty different role. But you have to do that if you want to these industry-focused initiatives going. So this is once again provides like a really nice little contrast here. She's talking about how, from her perspective, they've added these additional roles on, like you're a salesperson, you're a recruiter, you're, you know, all these roles that are non-educational to the educational, in addition to the actual educating of students in classes. So from her perspective, that it minimizes the amount of time that actual teaching takes up as a part of your total role, because you've got all these other responsibilities that are non-educational. So coding that, all these new roles, like a salesperson, borderline recruiters, that isn't really teaching. That's definitely unassociated. These are really distinct roles. And some of the other roles she later talks about is like being like a sort of disability consultant to advise students, and counseling support, which are like maybe associated, still not particularly teacher roles, like being a disability consultant or whatever, but are more connected than, say, being a salesperson or being a borderline recruiter. This next quote kind of, the next quote kind of showed that, but just all these different roles they're talking about. So let's jump through to this one, the third one, from Marie here. So now actually I don't do any teaching face-to-face with the students anymore. I do a lot more project work. And at the moment I actually work here 2 days a week and 2 days a week at the International Convention Center. So this quote from Marie is really interesting because she's still employed as a teacher by TAFE, but she doesn't do any actual teaching. Her role has entirely changed. And she's really positive about this. Like, to be clear, I think we'll see this later. She loves this. She loves the project work. She loves doing this coordination stuff, but she's not actually teaching anymore. And as a kind of interesting side note, like, she's won a number of teaching awards recently for the innovative stuff she's doing. She's setting up all these innovative programs, but doesn't actually do any teaching. So she has a fundamentally non-teaching role while still being employed as a teacher. Which is super interesting. And so, yeah, as I kind of emphasized, these are entirely unassociated with educating, really. And her winning awards is kind of important because it's showing what TAFE valorizes within their teachers. It's not their teaching practice, not their pedagogy. It's their ability to go out and generate business and like build connections and work with industry and come up with innovative ideas for programs, which is, you know, a different skill set, but shows the changing values. But this is more talking about her role. So her role is just fundamentally shifted. So altogether, you could say that they felt, similarly to the trades teachers, they felt a pressure to adopt an unassociated position within the field. They were adopting even less educational roles that were entirely disconnected with educating. Moving on to the values, in terms of relational autonomy. So how they describe them. So let's look at this first one. It's a balancing act. We're educating students and the leaders of tomorrow, but at the same time, we can't run loss-making courses anymore. That's just not good business sense. So long as we are meeting the requirements of delivering to the students the qualification, we have tough business decisions to make. So this is a great quote because it contrasts so strongly with the trades teachers who talk all about like, what I want is my carpentry student to be a better carpenter than I am. It's all about them, the value they get, the education they get. This is, so long as we are meeting the requirements of delivering the students the qualification. It's not, education for education's sake. It's like, we've got to meet those minimum requirements to deliver that qual. And he's talking about like, and that is set up in contrast with like now the values of the sector have shifted that we can't run loss-making courses anymore. That is like the imperative principle here. We try to do the educational stuff as much as we can, but the underlying important principle, the what's valorized within the field is this business principle. And it's like, as I kind of mentioned, describing it as the qualification is very non-educational way of framing it. I'll just quickly do that final quote. I guess we're becoming semi-privatized, fully privatized. So the reduction now is to meet the qualification is not such a bad thing because there's a lot of duplication on there. I think it's all about financing budgets. And so this kind of just really emphasizes that now, after the reforms in TAFE, it's all about financing budgets. That is how we run. We run as a business, semi-privatized as he describes it, which is, entirely distinct from those ideas of like the ethos of public education is the major goal. So to code that all together, I think we could say it's like unassociated relational autonomy. It's strongly oriented towards the principles of business. So what do we got? It's got the same problem with the slide title as the last one. Anyway, what do we got here though? We've got our hospitality teachers and they were oriented quite near the origin, ancillary, both positional autonomy and relational autonomy. They also felt the same sort of pull down to an unassociated positional autonomy, the same sort of pull down to an unassociated relational autonomy, which results in them also feeling pulled down into the exotic code. So they're feeling different, like the same sort of pulls with different intensities. And so what we kind of got now is like thinking about like how these two different groups
But
respond to reforms. Yeah.
just before you switch, Sharon wanted to ask that
sure.
hospitality as a field seems to lend itself to alignment with some of the values of neoliberalism and efficiency. She says he doesn't know, you don't have time now, but imagines that some of the responses to these reforms will be experienced along the lines of what the field they work in values to, like the traits that don't have the same emphasis on relationship building, being salespeople, etc.
Yeah, very much so. So this is like one of the overarching findings is like that these teachers, they draw on their associated fields and industries to set up how their values in education work. And like I'm kind of, we'll get there in a little second. Like the quotes in a second will kind of show that. But that is like very perceptive is like they are drawing specifically on the values of hospitality. As one of them I think talked about before, we come from a customer service oriented industry. So applying like customer service values to education or commercial values to education, it's not such a big deal. Like they really do have quotes like that. So just jumping to thinking about.
Can I interrupt you again with another one?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, Steve Kirk asked a few minutes before, he says, how did education for education's sake become the sovereign code and not, e.g., education for the purpose of preparing students for industry? From an insider's perspective, the latter may easily be the core purpose of VET?
Yeah, for sure. This is a really good question. And this kind of touches back onto what I was discussing before in terms of like the difficulties of VET as a field, because it does have that dual origin. The reason why I focus on having the educational as the guiding principle, this education for education's sake, is to do with the specific origins of vocational education in Australia. And basically, TAFE, the big public provider, was established in the 1970s, and it was a really big break from all the previous sort of professional and trades education that had gone before it, because it was underpinned by a specifically liberal humanist ethos. Like, it was really, really pro the emancipatory power of education. It was really guided by these educational principles. Like, when TAFE was founded, like, yes, it was vocational education and training, but it was very much leaning on the educational side, and that those principles were sort of built into the baselines of TAFE and continued for like the first 10 or 15 years. And so like a lot of the teachers who'd been around for a while, those were the values they adopted from the our original periods, let's say, and they've brought forward with them. And so that's why they see this as an affront. Like, many people now, like, if you joined TAFE even 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't associate it necessarily with these values, but these were the traditional values of the sector when it was kind of really founded as a sector in Australia. So you can flip it around. This is like getting into semantics, but something that I find quite interesting. You can flip it around so that like you have like more business-oriented principles as the sovereign. And in that instance, like your TAFE would be moving towards this new sovereign code, right? Like, because the whole field is relative, you can flip it over and everything will just move in accordance. It'll still relatively be in the same positions, but TAFE would be moving from like the exotic to the sovereign if you set up sort of like more business-oriented principles or whatever, or more training for trades, training for industries, that sort of thing, training for employment. You can shift it around. But I think that's one of the things about the target is if you pin down the target using autonomy codes, everything else is kind of spaced out relatively from that target. And it's not, weirdly, you want to pin down like a target that gives clarity to your analysis, that makes things clear, but it's not so much what you pin down as a target. Like, everything will move in accordance. I hope that is vaguely clear. This would be a lot clearer if I had like a whiteboard that I could like flip things around on, but hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity.
Pat?
Yeah.
Thomas says, I would be curious how your findings compare with analysis of policy documents from TAFEs, or in contrast or comparison with statements about them in the media by politicians, etc. Connections to industries and social movements will be interesting to look at too. I would imagine trades will be more sovereign vis-a-vis organized labor, for instance.
In terms of policy documents and stuff, if you want to have a bit of a look at that, my thesis, soon to be released, will be a great source. But yeah, I am looking to do more of that in the future as well. Actually, is the policy document aspect and how it's how they play out in reality is really interesting to me. I've only got a couple of minutes, so I just want to talk about the big picture thing. And this is touching back onto what Sharon said before, which was that teachers bring their values with them from whatever other sector they work in. Is how these teachers respond and react to reforms. So this is just going to be a couple of quotes, so it's not going to take as long. But what we're looking at here is this is our final graph, right? Our trades teachers from the core, our hospitality teachers closer to the center, all being pulled in the exotic code. Now, the important thing here is that, they look like similar pulls, but they're not. The hospitality teachers are being pulled a lot less far. And so what does that mean? So we're looking at the trades teachers' reactions to reforms first. I'm just going to pull these all up. But basically, the trades teachers really struggled to adapt to these reforms. They found them highly problematic, as you can probably have guessed from the previous quotes, but also from these ones here. So the first one, well, I'll just use this. That's the thing that really got under a lot of teachers' skin. We have teachers, Justin, I'll say it, go off on stress, just stressed out to the point of having breakdowns over this. So they both were unable to make this transition because it was such a jarring transition for them. They were being pulled so far. Their field was being reoriented underneath them so much that they found it really difficult. And they also resisted. The bottom quote kind of talks about this, but we were considered recalcitrant. We were resisting what we thought was bullshit. So they both were like unable to do it, but also actively resisted these changes in the field. If you compare this to my hospitality teachers, this first quote is just such a strong contrast. It's great. I suppose the staff are putting extra effort into keeping those values alive. These kind of talk about like educational values, but no one here, I don't think, very few people here are angry at TAFE for making the changes. Many of the trades teachers are very angry at TAFE for making the changes. And these other two quotes kind of illustrate the same point, that these hospitality teachers were able to deal with these changes. They brought a lot of the values and attributes from hospitality, this idea of working as a commercial business, connecting with other business partners, relationship management. They brought all these ideas and values from that sector and were more easily able to apply them. So while these reforms still initiated a change for them, the change wasn't as dramatic, which meant they were able to sort of adopt. There was more buy-in, let's say. Which I think is really interesting in terms of like what that means for the sector as a whole. The different bits of the sector will respond differently depending on how far they have to traverse across the autonomy plane. And that's why I feel like mapping the sector is so important, or mapping when you're looking at change in particular, because it can give you a bit of an idea as to like what aspects of reforms are going to be problematic if you're implementing like a universal blanket reform across a whole sector. So the final conclusions here really are that there was a strong code clash between the teachers' construction of vocational education and those of the reforms. So what the teachers felt the sector should be about and what their role in it should be, as opposed to what they felt it was under the reforms. Both groups felt that code clash, that there was a pretty substantial change. The second bit is that this code clash caused the teachers to feel increasingly alienated within the field and dissatisfied with their work. And this was particularly the case for the trades teachers as opposed to the hospitality teachers. The hospitality teachers, like I couldn't go into it as much, but there was still some of them who were a bit dissatisfied with a lot of the changes, but it wasn't nearly to the extent of the trades teachers. And the final important thing is that this dissatisfaction was seemingly proportional to the distance between their autonomy codes and the new autonomy codes of the field. So how far they were being asked to move. And that's why I really feel like that's what the value of autonomy codes in this study was, providing a way of mapping a field and showing differences and distances within it, which could point to potential problems in the future. And this has a range of implications for sort of policy design, but also within other fields of education doing analysis. And that's my lot for the week, I think.
Thanks, Pat. I'm just sorry. I was slightly slow in the uptake then.
That's all right.
I was just sleeping. No,
excellent. As per usual.
Yeah. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to say thanks to Pat, and also we're unmuting everyone. We muted everybody, and here we go with the echo. We muted everybody and turned off all your videos because just simply we were just a bit worried about killing the internet with Zoom. But I mean, firstly, I'd like to say thanks on behalf of everyone for Pat for doing that, and also he was the brave experiment. So well done, Pat, for that, and also for managing to cover. The first talk after you do a PhD is always a nightmare because everybody tries to do all of their PhD. It's very difficult to choose what to do. So thank you, Pat, for that. So firstly, I've got two things I want to ask people. It's firstly questions for Pat. And then after that, I'll ask you for any suggestions about how we can improve what we've done here, because we've got some ideas already. But first, does anybody have questions for Pat? And you are unmuted, so you can just ask.
Thank you, Pat, for the presentation. It's a very interesting take using autonomy codes.
Oh, thanks, Mauricio. Lovely.
People are saying things on chat, but they can actually say it personally.
They're being
as well.
shy.
That's okay.
Patrick, Chris Corbell here.
Yeah.
Really interesting stuff, because it's a field that I've spent a lot of time looking at the policy documents there as well. And I think this framing of it is really very helpful. And I think looking further at the policy background, I was particularly pleased to hear you refer to the history of TAFE and its establishment as something that was educationally focused rather than training. it's a very important reminder.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one because like having read a bunch of the policy documents and gone back through time, that's definitely the case. But if you describe that to anyone who works in like TAFE management now, they would not be particularly familiar with it.
No, that's right. And in fact, my PhD was also an analysis of TAFE documents too, in a similar vein, but in using a different framing. So I'd be interested to follow your work and see what's coming out of that.
Well, if there's nobody, oh, hang on, I've got to unmute myself. I know I'm still unmuted, aren't I, Pat? Am I?
No, you were talking, Carl. Go for it.
Yeah, oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if anybody doesn't have any more questions, I mean, if you do, just say them.
Sorry, okay, I have a quick comment really more than anything. Hi, Pat, Sharon.
Hey, Sharon.
This was a great session, and I'm so pleased that I could come without having to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So thank you for making it at 4 p.m. in Sydney. One of the things that I was so struck by listening to, especially your quotes from John and those guys in the trade, was a workshop I ran at the Durban University of Technology, which is one of our universities of technology in South Africa. And they have a lot of the same kinds of features as some of the VET, you know, they do a lot of vocational education. And some of this, I mean, there's different kinds of things to the TAFE teachers, because obviously this wouldn't be something we'd put onto our TVET teachers here, but this idea that now they have to upgrade their qualifications. So this woman who has taught radiography for 30 years and has won teaching awards, and very similar to your trades teachers. I'm teaching them to be excellent radiographers, and that's my job. And now she's kind of been told that she's not enough because she doesn't have a PhD and she hasn't published 5 papers. And I was just so struck also in some of those quotes at how, not just how angry they are, but also how hurt they are to some extent, and having built this whole career out of being a great teacher, and now suddenly, because of all these other not core things to their identity, like published and all the rest of it, you're now not enough anymore. And I suppose it just highlights the other side of which I'm sure you've looked at as well. It's just this human cost of all of this marketization and, you know, this alienation that the whole system is creating. Just, you drove it home really nicely.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a huge part of it for them. And that's the thing that was most impactful, like doing the interviews with particularly the trades teachers, some of the other teachers as well, was just that they described like really loving working at TAFE in the past, like they really love their jobs. And now they're just like so stressed, but also just underwhelmed by the whole experience that they just don't want to do it anymore. It's yeah, it's real sad.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks for the comment, Sharon.
Well, what I think, I mean, this is the first time, as I said, that we've ever done this. And what I would also very much welcome is not only, if you have any questions for Pat or suggestions or comments, please do send them to the LCT email forum. That's what it's for people to engage with each other. Because I mean, if you have a question for Pat, you can email him directly, but also we often would love to hear what that question is and what Pat's answer might be as well. So please do use the email forum. And another thing is, if you have any suggestions for how we can improve this is our experiment. It's the first time we've ever done this. Please let us know. I mean, I've already got several. We've already figured out that we are subjected to hacking, so we have to pick. Thanks to Jagan has sent us some really great information on that, so we now know how to avoid being hacked by trolls, so we can avoid that in future. But also things like
stupid Zoomers.
Yeah, but also things like we might, I mean, in the past we've always had round tables where everybody can interrupt at any time, but we kind of stopped that this time simply because we weren't sure about Zoom. And if Zoom turns out to be fine at this time of the day, at this time of the week, then we might return to that, or we might just make sure that people speak for a shorter length of time and have more time afterwards for more of a general chat. So we may just revert to a little bit more of a traditional thing, but try and make it more general chat rather than just questions to the speaker. So I'll have a think about that, and also I'll welcome anything from anybody who's got any ideas about how we can make that work better than we have already. General chat would be great, says Sharon. Yeah, I think so. What we'll do is we'll make sure, I'll just let the presenters in the future know that you don't have to fill up the hour and a half, go for an hour at most, and then we will use the rest of that time for chatting, as well as any interruptions through you can always ask questions at any time. So there's a couple of things, but has anybody got any other questions for Pat?
Pat, I would recommend that later you read a little bit of the chat, because you got a lot of people congratulating you for your PhD and things. So it will be
lovely.
If you want to,
so much.
Yeah, to get
Thomas has also asked, is there time for one more question? You found this dissatisfaction, so what is to be done?
Oh, the real dagger of a question.
End capitalism.
Yes.
Revolution.
Yes. Well, Thomas will be pleased to know that I've recently started working at the Department of Education a couple of days a week. So I'll have this sorted out very soon. Don't worry.
That's a fair question, but yeah.
But so, in all honesty, actually, there's a really vivid field of vocational education research in Australia, and so I want to contribute to that research, put out this problem, and that field has long complained that they're not listened to, but hopefully by adding and just another voice to the field, it adds support to a lot of these arguments that already exist about the problems of these reforms and that sort of thing. So there's kind of an academic purpose, but also ideally the vocational education.
Have you connected the hotspot for me to the wall?
The beauties of Zoom. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, if nobody's got any more questions, I'm going to thank absolutely everybody who's been here for being here, and thank you for joining in this experiment. And we're going to keep trying. We're going to do it again next week with Sharon. And I don't know if Sharon's still here. Yeah, Sharon's still here. So Sharon will go for we'll talk, try and aim for an hour. And what we'll do is we'll have more time afterwards for discussion and get things going afterwards as well. And also because we always need a little bit. There's always a few minutes at the start we'll need to allow people to join in before we shut the door, because that's what we're going to do in the future, is just lock the doors after 15 minutes or something like that. So thank you everybody for making this work, and it did seem to. And also please get in touch with me if you are excited about the possibility of being able to do one of these at some point in the future, next semester or this semester, or next year, or whenever it might be. So just let us know, and we'll try and make that happen. So thank you, Pat.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks everybody for coming. That was a very enjoyable, if a little bit bizarre, experience.
Yes, well, this is the future for the zombie apocalypse time.
This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a Zoom meeting.
Thank you, T.S. Eliot. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Beautiful. Thanks so much.
Goodbye.
Everybody's going to wander off slowly. Go away, everyone. We're done now. Thank you, Pat.
Yeah, no problems.
That worked
Carl?
pretty well. Yes?
I have a common question. ¿Puedo mutearte? Sorry, that was for past, because we are too... Okay. Because I was thinking that maybe, I don't know, but how many people are like new to LCT and how many people can maybe use this as a workshop of sorts, especially with what's going on or what's going to be happening at South Africa, and how many people could use this as a workshop to get an introduction to LCT and so on. So I don't know, I'm just thinking
Well, we could
aloud.
I could definitely, I mean, for example, do you want to stop the recording now?
Yes, I will.
Yes, she will, she says. It's off the record. You can deny everything.
Wait.
Not yet, not